for stopping by Big Top Gaming. My name is Brian, and in this video we're going to be talking about some list building strategies surrounding Daario Naharis, the Stormcrow captain, being utilized in the Targaryen faction. Now I think I've touched on Daario in the past, probably right when Neutrals Heroes 2 came out, but we're going to be really flipping the perspective on what Daario does, or at least kind of changing it a little bit through the Targaryen lens. I know that this is a long overdue video in terms of talking about Targaryens, but I just haven't had the time to work with them a whole bunch, so I wanted to make sure that I got the understanding that I needed to be able to deliver this type of discussion, and I feel like I've got a good enough amount of that to be able to talk about this particular commander in the Targaryen faction. I'd probably talk about the rest of them too, but Targaryens are very much, they more so are not so much, they're not so much theoretical. There's a lot that you have to do on the table. It's kind of like Free Folk, how they still manipulate the board so much with the way with the units that they bring, that things get really hard to talk about outside of just base strategy. So I hope that this comes across well, and I also wanted to take the moment to mention that I feel like Targaryens right now are going to be leaning into neutral stuff quite a bit. So I know that some people have issues with that being faction purists, but from story and play perspective, for me, the only difference between Dothraki Screamers and the Stormcrow mercenaries conceptually is just that they're painted different colors or their plastics different colors. And if that is a problem, you can use this stuff to change that. But in all honesty, never touch this stuff. Never let your miniatures touch this stuff. If you think Melisandre's missing nose was a problem for you, this paint could easily turn your whole range of miniatures into nothing but faceless men. 2 times the coverage just means 2 times more paint to get into your details and obscure those. But we'll kick this off by looking at what commander cards Daario brings to that Targaryen deck. The first one is Forced March. So this one we've seen on Harma before. It's quite a powerful card, especially when you think about what the Targaryens do. I'd already talked about manipulating the table through movement a bunch, and this just lets you select 1 infantry unit at the start of any round. You can pivot them and then make 1 free march action, then they happen to become weakened. So you do take a little bit of a risk, but we're going to be bringing some pieces to kind of mitigate that weakened token. It's not going to be so bad for this faction. The next card that's up for Daario is Mercenary's Cunning. So this triggers when an enemy would place a condition token on a friendly combat unit. Instead, the unit, your friendly unit, can suffer 1 wound and place that condition token on an enemy combat unit within short range of this unit. If that unit, or if the friendly unit was a Stormcrow unit, you can put any condition token down instead of that same one they put on you. So the thing that's nice about this card is that the stats for Targaryens almost universally are not super great, but their combat output is pretty decent. So whatever kind of token your opponent's wanting to drop on your units, whether it's weakened, vulnerable, or panic tokens, those are going to be pretty useful on their units too. I mean, of course, if we're playing against something like a Baratheon player and they throw something like a panic token on us, we're not going to get a whole lot of use out of it, but I mean, we can still get some. So it's better to have something like this trigger off of a Stormcrow unit, but not entirely necessary. If we think about just taking 1 wound, that can hurt sometimes, but when we're also looking at bringing cavalry, we don't have to worry so much about that 1 wound impacting their combat output so much, and this is just another way to kind of flip the script on your opponent. The next card is Reckless Strikes. I feel like this is one of the big money cards that Daario brings, especially when we start looking at the tools we're incorporating in our list, but this triggers when a friendly combat unit makes a melee attack before the dice are rolled. This attack gains +2 dice, and hit rolls from 6s do not allow defense saves, so essentially precision, but then that unit does suffer 1 wound for each miss. If the unit happens to be a Stormcrow unit, it can also roll its highest attack die value. So this card is a big rubber band, which is why I like it so much. If you happen to have a Stormcrow unit swinging with Reckless Strikes, not only are you taking a ton of wounds off your opponent with getting precision and an extra 2 dice to hit them with, but you're also being able to use your highest attack die value. So your opponent always has to worry about leaving combat units on low amounts of wounds, because even a unit of like Stormcrow mercenaries or something with a Stormcrow lieutenant can do a ton of work with only 2 wounds left in that unit with reckless strikes. You might lose some wounds off the top for that punishing you for each miss, but I don't think it's going to be that impactful when we're looking at what we're bringing here. Let's take a look at what Daario brings to the table. He is an attachment commander instead of an NCU one, so we get a lot of bonuses out of that when we look at, like, what is it, 70% or so of the scenarios. We get more points off of having an on-the-table commander, but he ends up giving the affiliation Stormcrow to any unit that he gets plopped into, so a lot of the triggers on his cards will help out if we're putting him into a unit that isn't normally a Stormcrow unit. But the big takeaway here for his commander attachment is loyalty through coin, and this is just an ability that says while you control the coin zone on the tactics board, this unit gains +1 to defense saves and never suffers penalties to morale. You also can't ever have panic tokens expended from the unit, so that's most of the time beneficial, but not going to be so much here. But the big thing is just Daario is going to be adding up a lot of He's going to be adding a lot of survivability to the unit as long as we keep getting that coin zone. And since we'd be healing any wounds we would be taking normally, this is a pretty decent amount of synergy for keeping his unit up and kind of showboating around the table. We'll be putting Daario into a unit of Unsullied Swordmasters. So we are going to get some benefit out of that Stormcrow keyword for Mercenary Cunning and Reckless Strikes. But the unit does come at a hefty price point. They're 9 points, but we do get a lot for that. We get Speed 6 Infantry, which is typically reserved for the more maneuverable kind of pillow-fisted infantry outside of something like Umber Berserkers. We also get a ridiculous attack stat line. They're hitting on 2s, which is unreal. They throw 10 dice at full ranks, then they decay down to 7 and 6. So even at their worst, they still are out-punching some of the other combat units that are in the game. And when we look at something like Reckless Strikes, we have essentially a 10, 7, 10 attack stat with +2 dice, so 12, 7, 12. With that card, this unit can easily one-shot a lot of other units out there. And they also have a couple other rules if just those stats weren't enough for you. They do come with precision and unyielding. So precision is just any rolls of 6 don't allow saves, and then unyielding just says that this unit can never gain condition tokens. So we do have a little bit of anti-synergy here, where we don't get to take full advantage of Reckless Strikes because Reckless Strikes grants like pseudo precision, and these guys already have it baked in, so we kind of lose a little bit of value there. And the unyielding benefit means that we're taking away the value in not having panic tokens placed on us that we get through loyalty through coin, and it also as long as we have the coin zone at least. And then we're also not being able to utilize Mercenary Cunning at all because these guys can't have tokens placed on them, period. But that's not the worst thing in the world, because I'd rather be able to just not have tokens placed on the unit, period, than have to worry about having that card in my hand, so I can shake these off when I need to. For their defensive stats, they're pretty good. The 4+ save is kind of middle of the road, and then a 4+ morale is amazing, so we shouldn't be having any problems with morale at all. And since we can't have our morale altered at all by penalties as long as we've got the coin with loyalty through coin, then we don't have to worry about like the big crazy bombs that could attack these guys, or just the little extra chip wounds from Vicious. And the 4+ save goes to that 3+ as long as we've got that coin zone as well. So even though we're losing some value by having Daario on this particular unit, we're gaining quite a bit, because these guys having a 3+ save and running around with the ability to utilize the full amount of Reckless Strikes is a pretty big benefit for them. I think that this is kind of going to be that Death Star unit if you want to buy into that that naming convention. The next unit we're going to be reaching for is Stormcrow mercenaries, and we're doubling down on these. They're just so inexpensive, and Targaryens, when they start taking some of their tools like the Dothraki or the Unsullied, even their NCUs, we start running out of points quite quickly, and if we want to grab a cheap option, the cheapest one we have is Jorah, but I just really don't think Jorah is in a place where I want to put him in a list ever as a unit. He just doesn't seem to be extremely survivable or impactful, and only having short range on his token ability is just not something that I'm super interested in. So Jorah gets sidelined for this for right now in favor of having 2 units of Stormcrow mercenaries. I think I've sung my praises for these quite a bit. They are very much a what you see is what you get unit. They are inexpensive. They have decent combat output, and they're somewhat survivable. They're very middle of the road, but they're honest. They're only speed 5. They hit on 4s, which isn't super great, but they roll 753, and that's not terrible when we look at attack stats. When we get down to the lower parts of it, it's not great, but remember that Reckless Strikes can bump these guys up to throwing 9 dice, and that's not all that bad. The 4+ save and 7+ morale isn't doing them any favors either, but with Mercenary Cunning, we can try and keep some of the tokens that would negatively affect them off of them, so that we can try and make sure that they are extremely useful in combat and not getting hindered by our opponent's shenanigans. They do have Adaptive, which is going to reduce the amount of points that we pay for a unit attachment by 1, and that's going to get real interesting, but they also have this ability Motivated by Coin. So being able to take the sword zone or the combat zone in the early turns is really helpful and can help you push a lot of damage across. These guys can take that coin zone, and if you don't feel like you need to heal anything in your army, you can instead just use these guys to make an attack. So it's a nice way to get some variable options from that one zone when we're going to be wanting to actually take that quite a bit because of some of the other options that we're grabbing. So with Adaptive, this is really where it comes down to how you want to customize the units and make sure that their roles are solidified in the list, which is usually going to be an aggressive one, right? They're not controlly, but maybe if you were a Lannister, you could put some Kingsguard in there to do some shenanigans with them. But for the most part, I want to put a lot of emphasis on combat prowess in this game or in this list, because the Targaryen Tactics deck is so combat oriented that having these units that can punch really well and hard is extremely beneficial to making sure the game goes the way I want it to. It can kind of set the pace or tempo of the game with that. So for the first unit, we're grabbing a Hero Box 2 guy, and we're going for Grey Worm Freed by the Dragon. He brings the Order Martial training that just says when this unit makes a melee attack, after the attack dice are rolled, the defender becomes vulnerable. So one of the things that kind of plagues Stormcrow mercenaries is that 4+ to hit and not having a ton of dice to do a whole lot with it. So putting something like martial training out allows us to get that vulnerable token and make the most of our attacks, since we're only going to be hitting about 50% of the time. But Grey Worm brings another ability with these guys. He gives them Combat Master, and that just says that this unit can always re-roll its melee attack dice and never becomes weakened. So the plague for 4+ to hit infantry is typically weakened tokens. So Grey Worm just says no to that. We can no longer have weakened tokens put on us. And again, this is another kind of anti-synergy that we've got building up around that Mercenary Cunning. But remember, it's only 2 cards that are in our deck. So it's not a huge deal for this unit. It just means that our opponent is only really going to get value out of Panic or Vulnerable on these guys, but then that's also something that we want on them as well. With putting Martial Training out, we're going to get full effect out of our attacks. We can always re-roll our dice, so the 4+ to hit isn't super problematic for us, and we can vulnerable our opponent too. So this unit becomes quite punchy and hurty that your opponent has to respect, especially when you take something into consideration like what this unit does with Reckless Strikes. Hitting on those 6s doesn't allow you to get any saves for that. We can re-roll all our hits, so we're less likely to take a ton of wounds off of the missing claws on the Reckless Strikes, and we also get to just be an overall nuisance. This is not a unit that your opponent can ignore, and Grey Worm is a really cool attachment But 2-point attachments really need to do a lot to get their value. But I think making use of the adaptive ability on the Stormcrow mercenaries to make him 1-point makes him really attractive for this list. In the second unit of Stormcrow mercenaries, from the aspect of needing the points to work out the way that they need to, I've just added the Stormcrow Lieutenant. He is a really helpful piece on this unit. He bumps their attack stat up to 8-7 or 8-6-4, which is a little bit more palatable than the previous one, right? I mean, throwing 8 dice on the first charge is really nice. You also end up getting Sundering for this, but these two abilities only come in when you have the coin zone controlled. So between loyalty through coin, the improved armaments, and the adaptive trait, no, what was that? Motivated by coin rule on the Stormcrow mercenaries, we're going to be putting a lot of focus and emphasis on that coin zone, and I'll kind of talk more about that when we get to our NCUs. And then we're going to round out the list with our final 2 units, and that's going to be doubling down on Dothraki Screamers. So the unit is mostly mercenary-centric, or not mercenary-centric. It's got a lot of infantry models in it, but this is also kind of a problem for us because we're not utilizing the raw talent that comes in having a bunch of cavalry. The army can manipulate the table quite a bit by having something like Dothraki Screamers because they're move 6 and they're very combat centric, so your opponent has to respect these. But the real way I'm looking at them is through the lens of like how you would a free folk raider block, right? I feel like free folk raiders really like to double up in order to get to influence combat in a positive way. So a lot of our infantry can do quite a bit of damage on the outset between the sundering attacks from one Stormcrow unit, the re-rolling all the time and getting vulnerable tokens out with the other Stormcrow unit, and then Daario's unit should be able to get particular opponents down to like 1 rank at least. So my Dothraki Screamers in this list are more of the cleanup crew. I don't want to be unpacking Dothraki Screamers early in the game because they're just not going to last very long. They have a 6+ morale, which is decent, but they've only got a 5+ save, and they don't have any rules to help them once they're jammed up in combat. So they hit on 3s, which is nice, but they're only throwing 7 dice at full ranks and 5 dice at their last rank, with no real ability to kind of pump that up unless we're doing something like throwing Reckless Strikes on them or one of the other Targaryen cards that kind of pump up the combat output. So the gist is to try and bully our opponent with the idea that we can get these long bomb charges out, but then we're really wanting to connect with the infantry that we're playing and then have these Dothraki Screamers come in and clean up a unit real quick so they're not jammed in, your opponent doesn't have the opportunity to heal them, and we can just move on to the next thing. It's going to kind of be like a 1-2 punch deal, and mostly these Dothraki Screamers are going to be babysitting the Stormcrow mercenaries, but we might have one of the Dothraki Screamer units positioned so that we can help out Daario's unit when he gets chunked up on something, because Daario's going to kind of be the star of the show, and the rest of the army is just going to be trying to facilitate him burning through combat units like crazy. That brings us to our NCU selection, and the first one we're grabbing for is Barristan Selmy, also from Hero Box 1. The Barristan ends up bringing a pretty sweet ability. He can always claim the zone and still use the ability of the zone. He doesn't have like a replacement ability, but Wisdom of the Old Knight is an influence, and you want to influence one of your units because while you're influencing it, and that unit's targeted by an enemy ability or tactics card, you can remove this card from that unit to cancel the effect of that ability or tactics card. I guess you really could use that. I think you can use it on an enemy unit and then stop them from doing their own stuff to that unit, but I'm not 100% sure on that interaction. But for the most part, Barristan Selmy is going to be trying to go into protecting Daario's unit a lot. The Unsullied are not immune to being messed with through tactics cards, so if we're doing something like wanting to try and play like a really sweet Reckless Strikes and our opponent throws down like I can't remember which card it is from Roderick, but if he tries to stop the unit from doing anything important, we can have Barristan Selmy kind of queued up on that unit right away to make sure that our opponent's not going to be messing with things. This is also helpful on other units when we want to make sure that we're getting through, like we can reflect back on the using the Screamers as a cleanup unit. If we are really trying to rely on those Dothraki Screamers coming in without being abused by our opponent, using Wisdom of the Old Knight from Barristan Selmy is going to make sure that we can get there and keep the game moving in the direction we want to. So Barristan Selmy to me feels like a real tempo play because you're kind of stopping your opponent from doing what they want so that you can continue the game moving and kind of snowballing in the way that you want it to. Next up, we're bringing Xaro Zohan Daxos, and this is an interesting one. So I haven't really talked about the Targaryen deck in general, but the base tactics deck for Targaryens only relies on having the maneuver zone in order to kind of get extra benefit out of the cards. But if you've been paying attention to how we've been building this list, there is also a new reliance that we didn't have before on getting the coin zone. And Xaro does not really kind of brook that trend, right? So he has an influence ability that doesn't replace the zone. So just like Barristan, we can get the zone thing out of there too. But while he influences a unit, at base, each time that unit is attacked, we automatically block one hit, which is pretty decent. Stormcrows don't have the greatest defensive stats, and neither do our Screamers. And even though we should be able to get some decent stat buffs onto Daario's unit, being able to block an extra hit from them is going to be nice. They'll appreciate it because they want to stay nice and full, so they're swinging as many dice as they can, as long as they can. But Xaro also has the ability that if you control the coin zone, you automatically block D3 hits instead. So this kind of, it's the list, like I said, revolves around having the coin zone a lot, but the tactics deck for Targaryens revolves around having the horse often too. So oftentimes when I've played my games against people with Targaryens, they'll often take that maneuver zone when it isn't the most advantageous thing for them, because that means that they're shutting off a lot of the output that my card, a lot of the snowballing that my cards can get put on top of them. Like Overrun, not being able to get that +2 inches to your charge distance. It isn't the worst thing in the universe, but it definitely is something that I'd rather have than be missing, especially if my unit or if my opponents kind of position their units quite a ways away from each other. So now they have to kind of think twice about this, because we've got 4 different things that will get pumped up if we have the coin zone, and we have all those other cards that are going to help out with us having the maneuver zone, plus our list in general likes to bully the table a lot. So your opponent's first activation when they have the top of a turn is no longer guaranteed, I have to do this or else things are going to get wonky. And if they happen to take a zone that's not either the coin or the maneuver, then we can kind of select which one we want in order to make sure that this turn plays out the way that we want to. So regardless, it means that regardless of what your opponent chooses, it means that we still have an option to make a lot of our things more optimal. Now, losing out on the coin is going to shut off a lot more, I think, than taking away the maneuver position. And I think a lot of the times when someone tries to block a zone from you, a good follow-up is to just take the tactic zone so you can keep building up those cards and make sure that the game is a little bit more accessible for you in terms of digging yourself out of bad situations, because you can't get these extra bonuses on your cards. But I think we've done a really cool thing here and tried to integrate another zone reliance into the army that our opponent really can't ignore. So every time they get that top of the turn, it's going to be a very difficult choice for them, because they have to choose between something like giving us these bonuses for devastating impact or overrun, and giving us something like Xaro blocking a bunch of hits and our Unsullied getting a 3+ save. So I'm going to rewind a bit because I kind of jumped the gun on saying something, but I had said that devastating impact we get a benefit out of, but we don't get that benefit in this list because it's not here, because this is a card that Grey Worm Commander brings and not the Targaryen standard deck. So speaking of Grey Worm, the reason why I even mentioned devastating impact at all is that when Grey Worm first got leaked in terms of the commander cards that he brought, I thought that Daario was just completely sidelined as a Targaryen commander. Like, there's no reason why you should ever take him, because Grey Worm is better in just about every way. Because he brings Forced March, so that's just a one-for-one checkbox on them. They're directly comparable in that way because they both bring that. Then you can compare Devastating Impact to Reckless Strikes, because they're both ways of upping the combat output, especially since they add 2 more dice or 2 more hits. But Devastating Impact helps you get there, while Reckless Strikes ends up giving you precision, which we really don't need in the unit that we're wanting to put it on. And then the only real difference is the Refuse to Yield. But when you compare it to Mercenary's Cunning, those 2 cards are both ways of kind of protecting a unit or healing it. It's just that Daario doesn't bring the tools that Refuse to Yield is really going to get a lot of benefit out of, where Grey Worm might have more Unsullied in his list. So why do I think that Grey Worm no longer sidelines Daario? Well, I think that when I started to come up with this idea of shifting the perspective on the zones in the Daario list, it kind of gave us a really unique perspective to work with in the Targaryen toolbox. Whereas Grey Worm isn't going to really want to do something like that. I think Grey Worm's very centralized in terms of what he wants to do, where we can kind of get a little tricky with Daario in this coin zone. I think you could flip the 2 commanders out, but the problem is that you're going to be losing a lot of efficacy in the Grey Worm version with this specific list loadout, because we're relying on that coin zone so much, and Grey Worm isn't really caring too much about that. So I think that Grey Worm he doesn't seem to be too far away from what Daario is, but he definitely brings an extremely different list perspective, and I think it's different enough to where you can't put Daario and Grey Worm on a rankable pedestal comparing just the 2 of them. I think that they both do something different enough. It's just that they both end up bringing a lot of the same tools that end up making it seem like they belong in the same space of discussion. So I don't think that Grey Worm is the 100% better choice than Daario. I just think that he's another one, and I wanted to kind of showcase that because I think Daario definitely can do some things in a unique and interesting way that Grey Worm just doesn't get to do. I hope you enjoyed this list discussion. I know that a lot of the Targaryen stuff is really in the theory chamber for me right now. I've played maybe 5 or 6 games as a Targaryen player, so it definitely isn't enough to really get a good feel for how the faction functions, but I do think I've kind of constructed this idea that the Targaryens really get a lot out of abusing the table and not so much abusing activations like some other armies do. So when I do something like put in 2 NCUs, I don't really feel the impact of it, because I'd rather manipulate the table better than manipulate the tactics board, and my opponent can just do whatever they want on it because I don't care. Especially with this list, because I'm able to manipulate it through another way with creating reliance on another zone instead of only having benefit from that maneuver. I also think that some people might have been expecting to get a Targaryen commander that's an actual Targaryen. You know, they bring their purple cards and everything. That will definitely be the next list discussion that we do. I feel like I've ignored, in quotes, the Targaryen discussions long enough that it definitely warrants me talking about another Targaryen commander. So if you're interested in anyone in particular, leave a comment in the area in the section below, and I'll kind of use that to kind of leverage some things and try and stack which one I want to put out next. Otherwise, thanks for sticking around to the end on this one, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.